Well, again, welcome everyone to this Presbyterian Association of Musicians town hall meeting. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Lisa E. Dahill. Lisa is the Miriam Therese Winter Professor of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. That is a great title. And that's at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, formerly Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. Before her appointment at Hartford International University, Dr. Dahill taught worship and spirituality at Trinity Lutheran University in Columbus, Ohio, and religion at California Lutheran University. Professor Dahill is the convener of the Ecology and Liturgy Seminar at the North American Academy of Liturgy. She is co-editor of the 2016 book Eco-Reformation, Grace and Hope for a Planet in Peril, as well as many other books and articles. And she's currently writing a book titled Jesus in the Earth, Rewilding Christian Spirituality. I can't wait to see that. And Dr. Dahill is also a Bonhoeffer translator and scholar, which is wonderful. So readers of the baptism issue of Call to Worship will know Dr. Dahill as the author of the compelling article, This Creek is the Baptismal River, Baptism as Immersion into Reality. And I have invited her to begin with a summary of that excellent article. So Lisa, you'll share your screen now and please take it away. But welcome to you, Lisa, and welcome to all of you to this Presbyterian Association of Musicians Town Hall meeting.
Thank you, David. I'm so honored to be with all of you and to be invited to present this work and engage in conversation with you. So I will indeed share my screen, and I have some slides to give a little backstory first, and some immersion, if you will, and how I sort of think about these questions in the broadest sense. So yeah, baptism as immersion into reality. This creek, the baptismal river. So sort of stepping back, like how did this come about, this project, this insight, this way of thinking about baptism? So I'm new on this particular place, this land, Tunxus Podunk land in central Connecticut. And we will have time later if we want to talk about questions of how baptism and place and river and thinking about one reality rather than holy church, kind of unholy rest of the world, but one reality, one divinely permeated place. Shapes also how we think about our relationship as European descendants, which I am, and I don't know about all of you, how I think about my relationship also with the people who are indigenous in this place and questions of eco-justice that arise as well. So I give a land acknowledgement as a way of signaling openness and interest and the importance of engaging that question as well. And then, so we're living in this space, as we know, where climate is weirding, climate is destabilizing. We continue to pump fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and we're living in a baked-in reality in which the emissions from years ago are still affecting our climate, even if we cut them dramatically today. So we're facing this very difficult future, and already in the present, massive unsettlings beginning and shaking of foundations of our food systems and water systems and cultural and social and economic systems, with implications, especially, of course, for the poorest humans. So all of that is how and why Larry Rasmussen in Earth Honoring Faith writes, our present way of life exceeds the recharge rate of Earth. And these images that we mostly have bracketed out from our awareness by our, media sources that are not inviting us into the urgency of these questions as fully as we might wish. Pope Francis in his encyclical wrote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look like an immense pile of filth." And we face this looming climate crisis that affects people. I love this slide for its sense of the urgency that is towering over us as we kind of go about our little lives down here, right? And we're not always aware of the scope and the scale of the problems, that the crises that are bearing down on us. And yet we are on some level. And these are spiritual questions, they're psychological questions. High levels of mental distress among especially young people who are perhaps more aware of the urgency of these questions than the ones who might fill many of the pews in mainline churches. But all of us are aware on some level and have to keep these questions and the fear or panic or rage or despair that they elicit somehow at bay. And that takes a tremendous psychic toll and a physical toll. And we need to be able to face the questions we're facing and to do that somehow in the context of our faith. And yet, again, for the most part, Christian faith and practice, despite our best efforts and papal encyclicals and trying, and those who are on this call are probably the ones who are most active in trying to help people make connections to the larger natural world. And yet by and large, people don't always see this connection, or church practice and worship and theology don't always help people make connections between our faith and the life of the world. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I'm a Bonhoeffer scholar as noted, wrote from the heart of the conspiracy and his work of opposing Hitler. You might think this is a great good versus evil moment, right? And this very dualistic kind of rhetoric that we sometimes use about the conspiracy or even about Bonhoeffer, but he himself in his ethics is pushing hard against any kind of dualisms. And specifically, he says God split from world is a problem. This dualism of God versus world as makes an abstraction of each. And so I've, as a Bonhoeffer scholar and someone who's been reading this stuff for a long time, translating the late Bonhoeffer for the Fortress Press series, I've spent a lot of time inside this assertion of his, and it began to sink into me ecologically as well. And on a sabbatical 10 years ago, I just kind of, from Trinity Seminary, kind of blew out into the natural world in a big way, in a really wild kind of way, and have ever since then been trying to come to terms with this sense of taking Bonhoeffer seriously on an ecological level as well. What would it mean to take seriously Bonhoeffer's assertion in the Ethics, in this same treatise, that all concepts of reality that ignore the union of God and the world in Jesus Christ are abstractions? There are not two realities, but only one reality in Jesus Christ. Rather than this symbolic split we have created in many forms of Christianity and other religions, but speaking as a Christian, in which there's holy space, and then there's unholy space, and there's holy water, and then there's kind of unholy water, and there's practices that take place among humans in a room, and then there's the rest of the world. And that sabbatical 10 years ago, again, just kind of blew open this sense of the sanctuary walls. I wrote in an essay in the book David mentioned called Eco-Reformation. My essay in that volume was called Rewilding Christian Spirituality. And I wrote about how my big, strong sense of Jesus for years dissolved into the natural world, and the walls of the chancel dissolved, and the whole world became chancel. And so what does it mean to take seriously assertions like these, in this case, Bonhoeffer, that there are not two realities, God and world, as separate realities, but one reality in Jesus Christ, one reality. So the title of the essay, This Creek is the Baptismal River. This is it. And the related question then, so what happens then when Christianity moves outdoors? This is the holy reality. This is the sacred reality. How do we navigate the creation of navigate, advocate for, and create forms of ritual practice that invite people into this one reality that is the divine reality, rather than separating us from the natural world as we do our holy rites, our holiest rites, our sacramental rites. So these are some of the animating questions behind the article.
Thank you. It's really helpful to understand all that background.
Yeah, good. Yeah. And so the article itself begins with an experience on the river, and this is the Connecticut River. It is from an experience called River of Life Pilgrimage, a 40-day pilgrimage along the whole length of the Connecticut River from its headwaters in Maine all the way to Long Island Sound. And I was present. This is Colebrook, New Hampshire, way north in New Hampshire, just across the border from Maine, in stage 2 of the pilgrimage. So most people, except for the guides, no one did the whole 40 days. Most people came in just for stages. I was on stage 2 along with one other participant. And we, this was 4 days, 4 nights, 5 days, setting off from Colebridge. And there we are again, setting off. And so it was Pentecost Sunday, June 4th, 2018. And so late spring. River was high, and this part of the river, you don't see it in these slides, is narrow, is fast, at times rocky. We had some rapids. It was cold. The second full day on the river, it rained pretty much all day, and the high was 45. And we were, you get wet in the canoe, and it was 45 degrees. And so like this was an experience of definitely being out, right? We're camping out in wild places. There are predators out there. The river is cold. The air is cold. You can't get dry. And so very much kind of this sense of the wildness of the world and immersion in it and the danger of it and wanting to be careful and not, stupid. And so we knew as we were paddling that there was a Lowhead Dam approaching at the end of the first full day of canoeing, which was the longest day as well, at Lyman Falls. And a Lowhead Dam is a dangerous thing. So I couldn't find an image of Lyman Falls, but I found this picture of Lowhead Dam, and you see the handy little label there, drowning machines, because as boaters know, going over a Lowhead Dam can suck you into the churn at the bottom of the dam. And you can get caught in this and not only be unable to get out, but people can't pull you out easily either. And so people drown. About 120 people drowned in the US in the 3 years from 2018 to 2020. I think it was the citation in my article. So we knew this Lowhead Dam was coming, and Mark, the guide, had instructed us that we're going to get way over we're going south between New Hampshire on the left and Vermont on the right, west and east. And so we're going down and river left. New Hampshire is the safe side to go over, because the Lowhead Dam was falling apart, basically, was only partially intact, and over on river left it was safer to go through. But a tree had fallen as we just above the falls, and there was no marker. There were no warning signs like in Ohio, where I had kind of learned to kayak, and there would be these big warning signs saying, half a mile ahead, Lowhead Dam, get out now, or 1,000 feet, stop, 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 not here. So a tree had fallen, and we had to go way over to the Vermont side to get around, and then suddenly there we were at the dam. And so I wrote about the experience of being in the canoe practically on the edge of this dam, staring down into our death below, and having to back paddle as hard as we could to try to stop ourselves from the flow of this river that's gushing past us and pushing us forward. And we managed to sort of stop and sort of scoot over just a little to the left and slide over in a dangerous place, but not fatal, and kind of bounce around at the bottom and get through to the calmer waters beyond and pull ourselves off to the campsite, which was right there. And I wrote about my legs shaking so hard I could hardly get out of the canoe from the fright, and that I didn't take my breath for granted that night. So this time on the river was this launching into wildlife and its danger and its beauty, and this sense of collective necessity of collective presence and creativity and improvisation and survival in this case. And then just the beauty of all that we experienced as well, and the many forms of wildlife and seasons and human life as well, Native American and early European history, as well as contemporary communities welcoming us. So this story feels iconic of sort of looking at what would it mean to baptize into local waters as a primal means, a ritual means of helping to knit back together that alienation I was talking about earlier, in which we've sort of created in more recent centuries. This was not the practice of the early church. We've created baptism as a practice that's cut off from these larger waters. This is the Connecticut River further down, just to give you an image of that. And the book in which I first wrote about these questions, Rewilding Christian Spirituality and Eco-Reformation. So the practice of the early church, of course, Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan, and the disciples baptized people into this same river. And throughout early church practice, the Didache invites the practice of baptism into living waters, meaning flowing waters full of life. And in more recent centuries, of course, we've made of baptism something different that reinforces that symbolic sense of there being special sacred spaces to which only humans are invited in relation to a God who is somehow more primally related to humans or something than the rest of the world, and this separation from the larger wild waters of one's place. And so we have rites that take place without any reference at all to the local creek, and people may not even know where the local creek is or what its name is or how you would get there, right? And it might not be safe to put a baby in, even if you did know how to get there. And yet none of that would seem to have anything to do with what we're doing in this room, in this bowl, right, with these little beakers of water and babies all dressed up, or whoever, in this ritual that seems to have no relation to the larger questions of Earth's hydrology or Earth's life. So we've created this separation, this abstraction, what Bonhoeffer would call an abstraction, making baptism into on some level, participating in that larger abstraction of God versus world. So in the article, I sort of trace all this and how, in fact, asserting things like on page 23, forms of religious practice that ignore, assume, or perpetuate this alienation, this separation between the life of the natural world and God, are in fact complicit with it. We're reinforcing that alienation by practices like these kinds of indoor baptisms that fail to connect us to the larger endangered life of the world, I assert. So that's kind of a bold assertion, right? Rituals such as indoor baptism using dead water in a ceremony meant only for humans in a special holy room to which only humans are invited does not challenge the ecological and perceptual or symbolic alienation threatening all of life on Earth, but actively reinforces it. Same assertion. So what do you think? Is that true? And then, so the proposal then to return the practice of Christian baptism in its most normative sense to the practice of the early church and of Jesus himself, of baptism into local waters. And so part of this proposal is the assertion that practice itself preaches, and that before we say any words, so you might say, yeah, well, okay, so we do indoor baptism, but we talk a lot about ecology in our church, or we're careful to talk about where the water comes from and what the watershed is, which is awesome. If you do that, that is awesome. And yet the practice itself preaches, and the place preaches. And so the movement of baptism outdoors preaches in a big way that much more than an indoor, non-immersive and local waters form of practice can do, even with all the best words that might go along with it. So how does practice itself preach? How does place preach? So a new sense of sanctuary, a new sense of the font, a new sense of who the saints or the community is, and what it might mean to be baptized into that whole wildness and all the microbes in the water and the fish and the insects and the birds and the mammals and the humans who might have no permanent homes who are camped nearby, and all the wildness and danger of the world. Might not baptism be something that invites us into all of that, precisely in immersing into the larger body of Christ, this incarnate one who fills all that is. So I assert on page 23, also the second column, baptizing in local waters is the core Christian ecological practice. I'm asserting that. the one that invites us into a bigger sense of what being Christian means, what the Christian life is, and in relation to whom it is lived and experienced and celebrated. So let's see, what time is it? I can't see time on the...
It's 1:22.
All right, so I should finish up here.
This is
So
such
yeah.
a compelling and important proposal, and I love the way you connect it to not making these abstractions between the church and the world, and being baptized into the one reality, including all of God's creatures and people and microbes. This is really fascinating, important stuff. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so let's see here. So the rest of the article kind of spins out into questions of like, how is this possible? Isn't this really too hard or too weird or too, I don't know, far from our capacity to enact? It would require a lot of change, a whole rethinking. Isn't this too hard, kind of? So that's a whole topic we can engage. What about questions of access? Both like, can you even get to the river? In Southern California, where I moved here from, you couldn't even get to the river. Like it's in a concrete channel for one thing, and then there's chain link fences on, locked up on either side. So also, there's hardly ever any water in the river in Southern California, except when it's rained, in which case it may be floodwaters and too dangerous. So like how, so questions of access, but also questions of access, like what about grandma coming in who can't navigate down to the riverbank to watch the baptism of her grandchild? Or questions of access having to do with pollution in the water. Are you really going to want to put somebody into this water? So lots of levels on which questions of access are really important that we can talk about. And then questions kind of ethics. You could say it's the flip side of that. Like, if the water is too polluted to put a baby in, then we've got a theological problem on our hands in this watershed, and we need to be urgently working with the local scientists and politicians and industry or whatever the problem is, to make, help restore and clean up the waterway so that it's clean enough to put a baby in. And the water needs to be clean enough to put a baby in if we're all going to be living here, right, on this earth, which is becoming more and more precarious as economic systems may crumble in climate chaos. And we need to be able to root and live in a life-giving way in our local watershed. So these questions matter. It's not just a theological abstraction, as it were. And yet the practice of baptism in the watershed makes it also a theological question. So that's an important problem, if it is a problem in your area, and one that the ethics of this practice, what kind of life does this practice of baptism in local waters give rise to, is a different kind of sense of what being Christian means. What is required? What is what kinds of things does Christian discipleship entail? And then the other sort of piece is a narration of, in the middle of the article, of, and I thought I might read that, but there's not time.
No, please go ahead.
What might it feel like to experience this? I think this is a fun part. So yeah, I'll just read this and then close.
That sounds great.
And receive questions. So, okay. So all these questions of access and pollution and all this, so like recognizing their importance, but putting that aside for a moment, imagine then a parish near that Connecticut River up in northern New Hampshire or Vermont. Imagine the water is clean enough to swim in, to baptize in. Imagine there's a sweet spot with calmer waters where the river bends wide, maybe a little beach, maybe a parking lot and path, or a bikeway not too far away. Imagine you are being prepared for baptism into a Christian faith that takes seriously your relationship with the rest of the biosphere, with the actual creatures of this place who live here with you. Imagine that catechesis for baptism involves learning many of these creatures, their names and habitats, their needs and distinctive voices and movements, perhaps In preparing for baptism, the community invites you to spend time with one of those creatures of your place, to let them mentor and accompany you through this rite into Christian belonging. Now imagine that your baptismal ceremony takes place in this river you are getting to know. The day is brisk, the water cold. It's a little breezy, maybe a storm is approaching. It's late spring, Pentecost. Birds are everywhere, calling and flitting and feeding their young, buds and leaves and flowers bursting out in every direction. You wade in, maybe gasping a little. As you move deeper, you can feel the edge of the river's current beyond the baptismal area, tangible and dark, flowing, rich. At waist high, you stop with the pastor, your sponsors, your friends and family who have waded in with you. Others remain on the shore within earshot. Here, with full voice, you renounce the evils that keep you from loving God, the world, yourself, other humans, and all creation with all your heart. Here you claim the faith of a creation-saturated triune God, the vision of a world beloved and redeemed in every corner and crevice, the way of passionate, nonviolent, wholehearted mercy Jesus taught and teaches. And into all of this, the water filled with the Spirit of God oxygenating all the minnows and fry and larvae and nymphs and microbes, algae and mussels and fish and frogs filling this river, you are baptized. You come up dripping with the bodies of these creatures and into the birdsong of the place, a heron swooping past, a turtle sunning on the rock. Your human community in Christ beaming at you and already taking off their warm, dry shoes and socks, their body-heated garments and coats to clothe you in love. This is the baptismal reality. It's exhilarating, totally unforgettable, totally immersive. So there you have it.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so grateful for that invitation to imagine this kind of baptism. And I want to invite our participants now to imagine baptism in this way, baptism in your parish creek, wherever that might be. What questions does that raise for you? Is that something that you can imagine? What resistances do you think folks might have, and how might we overcome them? So let me remind you that there are two options for asking questions to our presenter. You can use the Q&A feature, or you may also use the chat, and I will try to be monitoring both of those. But as we give folks a chance to ask questions, Lisa, let me ask you, are there particular things that when you raise this proposal, are there particular things that people have concerns about? You've mentioned a couple of them already: access, the cleanliness of the water, the safety of the ritual. When these kinds of, so first, what are other forms of resistance, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, those are big ones. Others include things like how can we baptize at the vigil if the water's frozen where I live in Minnesota, say, and that's just not going to work, or at least
so it might have implications.
I guess in Russian, right? Sorry, I was going to say, in the picture we see an image of Russian Orthodox Epiphany baptism of Jesus, and they famously jump into the water when it's frozen. So right. Like I could say it could be done at the Easter Vigil, even in Minnesota, but like that's not an easy question. And I had another one as well. In addition to access, yeah.
That's what's so fascinating about this proposal, is that it does have all this network of implications.
Yes.
Things like when we baptize. And,
yes, exactly.
The relation to the Christian year. We have to think ecologically about those questions.
Yes, exactly. And so the fact that we put into the river on Pentecost that too felt symbolic, even though it was just kind of coincidental on my stage of the river pilgrimage. But nevertheless, baptismal practice might shift toward Pentecost rather than the vigil. So something is lost in that. And it's important to acknowledge this proposal would mean that some things would be lost. For every river baptism that, a grandma can't attend, or every Pentecost baptism that isn't taking place at the vigil, surrounded by all those stories and that primal movement of death to life. So it's a proposal of, and I note this in the article, it's a proposal for the normativity of baptism outdoors, which doesn't mean, in my reading, that every baptism has to take place in that way. But that we, as I put it in the article, that the question would become for me, how can we move closer and closer and closer to the river? And so the first step might not be moving the practice of every baptism out into the river, but things like affirmations of baptism. So confirmation could happen in the river or by the river, in much closer relationship to the water, and perhaps getting the kids in the water if it's, teenage confirmation, as is the case in many places, and creating a much different immersive sense of what Christian faith means and what confirmation means than a ritual in the church, and with much more kind of freedom, I think, for play and for creativity and for edginess and moving outside of the box and all of that. And other forms of affirmation of baptism could always take place in the local creek, for instance, even if we don't feel ready to move the whole practice of baptism into the creek. There can be other ways to do that.
I appreciate that you offer those smaller steps along the way toward making this a normative practice in the church.
But also to say that just as there are losses in this movement, there are also losses in the movement indoors that we haven't, I think, adequately recognized, and gifts to be gained in moving outdoors that also need to be honored. And so, for instance, do all of the challenges together represent such an insurmountable obstacle that we just can't do it, or so many symbolic losses that we just can't do it? Maybe. And certainly in many places today, that would be the case, because the normative practice is still indoors. But nevertheless, I have a question on page 25. How should the ritual enactment of experiential kinship with the whole wildness of God's wild world rank in relation to safety at all costs, which is what these questions of access often, but not only, amount to. And similarly, symbolically, is the symbolic connection of immersion into the whole ecosphere one lives in, the whole watershed, and all of these creatures and all of this kinship, how does that rank in terms of, I don't know that you can rank them, but is not that kind of gift of symbolic immersion also important to place alongside the possible loss of things like baptism at the vigil, depending where you live? So there are, and that given the ecological emergency we're facing and the cost of the alienations we've created by these indoor rites, I'm proposing that I think that a little bit of movement toward outdoor immersion, even though it has difficulty, is worth the cost, is a bigger benefit and gain.
Thank you.
So
I do see a question now from Terry, who says in the chat, access is absolutely a concern, but I am wondering how much we can use technology to assist with some of those issues. Say more, or do you have thoughts, David? Well, I think Terry is suggesting that using Zoom, as we are with this webinar, might be a way to allow folks to bear witness to the baptism remotely.
What a great idea!
And to attend in a different mode.
Yeah, is that what you meant, Terry? Put in the chat. Is that what
Terry
you were thinking?
says yes. That is what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Terry also says, here in Raleigh, North Carolina, we recently experienced a mass shooting near our closest river. As you were speaking, I began to imagine what other healing might also take place if baptism happened where this significant event in our community took place. Wow. So, yes.
Yeah, really powerful. Thank you. And you're reminding me also of an insight it's like the flip side of what you're saying. An insight from my colleague in the NAL Ecology and Liturgy Seminar, Kristen Daly-Mosher, who lives in Seattle and had heard an earlier version of this material and said that what struck her was what kinds of baptismal metaphors would emerge, in her case, in a salmon running river into which she would be participating in baptism in Seattle. Paschal metaphors of death and life, of the salmon moving upstream to spawn and giving their lives as they give birth to the new generation of salmon. And salmon as a Christological metaphor is something that hadn't occurred to me before, but it occurred to her out of her river context, and baptism into her river gives rise to a whole new set of baptismal metaphors than the baptismal metaphors that will arise in Terry's context in North Carolina. And so too, the local traumas and grief that this kind of outdoor practice can help heal, as Terry is noting, the same. So greater levels of contextual specificity, but also contextual symbology, rather than all of us having the same kind of symbols in our indoor practice, powerful as they are. And a fully immersive outdoor baptismal practice in all kinds of places would really just give rise to a multiplicity of baptismal and paschal local metaphors that we can't even imagine now, because we don't practice in that way, of what kinds of symbolic connections will arise from this kind of practice. So we can dismiss it and say, oh, well, I wouldn't want to lose the vigil, which is valid, but we don't know what we're missing until we experience it, and what kinds of new Christological and theological and baptismal metaphors and symbols will arise in different places.
Yeah, it would give us whole new ways of thinking and talking about, praying about, and experiencing baptism, and who the triune God is, and to whom we are baptized. What the body of Christ means.
Amen. That's right.
A comment. Go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say, in conversation with a colleague in Minnesota, not about the vigil winter question, but she just happens to live there, and talked about how for her autistic son, questions of access, access becomes much easier for her son and for her family when worship is outdoors than when it's indoors. Like, they sort of can't come to indoor church anymore. It's too disruptive. Her son is too disruptive for the community, and it's hard for the family. They can't relax. And so when worship is outdoors, then they can all be there. And so it is quite possible that questions of access, again, we don't know who isn't here in the indoor church. We only know who is here and might not be able to go to the river, but there are probably communities of people who will show up at the river in time who would never set foot in a church. So questions of access can flip both ways as well, even as I don't want to minimize the importance of those questions for those who are indoors in church and want to, participate.
Yeah, that's an important point. So outdoor baptism might open up access for others. Yep. It occurs to me, it also makes it more likely that baptism would be a public witness.
Yes.
A way of demonstrating our faith and our practices in the public view instead of behind sanctuary walls.
That's right.
Tom has a comment and says, baptism in living water is a sacred acknowledgement of our relationship to both our spiritual and human connections with all of creation.
Amen.
Our relationship with spiritual and human connections with all of creation. Indeed. And I think that's part of what's so compelling about this article.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Really well said. Yeah. The water itself is alive when it's, full of creatures.
Full of creatures.
Yeah.
And Sally Ann asks, what conversations have you had with leaders, presiders, communities in traditions that may have been practicing baptism in local water for years? And she continues, in practice, believer baptism and evangelical traditions do have experience with the logistics of baptizing in local waters. And she's wondering about those ecumenical conversations, although acknowledges that there may be differences in the ecological, theological, baptismal language among our different tradition. So has your work led you into conversation with folks who have been baptizing outdoors for a long time?
Yeah, only kind of informally. I haven't.
We may be frozen.
Oh, am I frozen?
Can you all still hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Am I frozen?
I think we're live again. So so yeah, has this led you into ecumenical conversations?
Yeah, conversations and appreciative sort of storytelling. Again, in Southern California, it is evangelical communities often who baptize in the ocean. So, you know, river baptism is hard, but ocean baptism, many communities participate in that. Then they tend to be evangelical communities. I have students had students in my classes at Cal Lutheran who would talk about their baptism in the Pacific and how it ever since then, whenever they go swimming, that it feels like an immersion in mercy or an immersion in grace, or, you know, I don't know if that's their language, but that connects them back to the gift of that baptismal experience every time they go back in. And certainly many African American communities, especially in the rural South, still never left the rivers. And so, yeah, that's an important point of connection. And what can we learn? And acknowledgement that it isn't all Christians who have created this kind of artificially separated form of baptismal practice. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'll continue to ask folks to let us know your questions. I see that Jeremy writes in the chat, I love this idea of breaking away from dualistic thinking of God versus the natural world. As you've laid it out, baptism seems to be such a natural place to make this connection. Jeremy says, I'm curious if there are other places in our worship practice where these same sorts of connections might be made.
Yeah, great question, Jeremy. And I can't remember if your time at Trinity included we did an indoor-outdoor worship service in 2012 fall for the gathering of Lutheran theologians at Trinity and Capital University on eco-theology. And so I designed an indoor-outdoor ritual, Eucharistic ritual, that was engaging some of these questions. And so we started indoors and honoring the indoor space and the pipe organ and the fact that you can hear better for preaching when you're indoors, and people might need to sit for, you know, part of the service and not stand the whole time. And so the goodness of indoor worship. And then we at the peace was the invitation out and to share the peace with one another, but also with various creatures and pieces of the natural world that we will encounter as we head out to another location, which was about a 5-minute walk or 10-minute walk, where we had the Eucharistic part of the service. And so the peace was the procession as well, an invitation into sharing peace along the way and listening for the peace that the other creature might want to give to me in turn along in this procession. And then we had the Eucharistic rite in an outdoor lawn kind of area surrounded by trees and near the creek. There was a creek that ran near the seminary. And so there were elements like the offering we had carried the bread and wine with us, so we weren't bringing elements to the table, and there wasn't a table, it was a circle and people holding the elements. So there wasn't, that piece had happened already by just coming. So the offering was, I invited people to take off their shoes and socks, for this is holy ground, and to experience with bare feet and vulnerable, tender skin, the actual grass and soil. And so, that's an example of where outdoor worship, again, is harder. It's a lot easier to just stay indoors. This is harder. You have to figure out how long is it going to take to walk to this place, and can everyone do it? Or do we need to provide some way to get some people there? Is this even going to work kind of and then is there, making sure there's no glass in the grass, or, that this is going to kind of work ritually. So take off your shoes, for this is holy ground, and standing on bare feet. As the offering, as the self-offering. and then a new Eucharistic prayer and a libation at the end, which is something that some communities already do, kind of feeding the birds with the Eucharistic bread. But making that explicit as returning as Jesus arose from earth, and I can't remember the language I wrote, so and returned, I can't remember, so too this bread and wine returns to bless the earth or become Christ's presence in the world or something. And literally, right, this real presence becomes taken up into the mouths of the birds and the worms and the microbes in the soil, and the whole earth becoming Eucharistic and the wine poured out. And then at the end, we use the language, instead of go in peace, serve the Lord, because we were already out. So the sending, so we were thinking about, my preaching colleague, Hank Langnecht, and I, as we thought about this service, we're thinking about the sending happened already at the peace, in a sense, like we're already out. We're not being sent in the usual sense of living in the world as the sanctuary and chancel. Although that too, but the sending, the literal part of the sending had already sort of happened. So at the dismissal, we said instead, abide in peace, inhabit the Lord, thanks be to God. So thinking about how does outdoor worship work when it isn't just a matter of moving outdoors, what we do in with an extension cord for the keyboard and chairs in rows, and just doing the same thing outdoors, but like thinking liturgically with the larger creation and its presence, and including all of these creatures in the prayer in new ways. So how does the language shift, even as the forms of the Sanctus that we sang, we use traditional Lutheran ELW forms and hymns that people could sing a cappella, in order to show that, this is still real Eucharist, but we're doing it in this interspecies way. And so the practice and the place preach, and how does our language shift as a result? So that's one example. I've also written an essay on predation and the fact that our bodies too are food, that we think of ourselves as kind of the top of the food chain, right? We eat, but we're not eaten because we put ourselves in, or maybe we cremate ourselves so our bodies are not bioavailable to anyone, or we want to pump them full of chemicals and put them in a steel box so no worms are ever gonna, but we would never want our bodies just to be eaten. Like that's just unthinkable. And yet that's the biological gift, that our bodies too become food, and this Eucharistic reality that this body full of the presence of Jesus Christ and word in the sacrament becomes food for the worms and the microbes and everybody else when I die. And so can we think Eucharistically about death and predation as it affects us too, and how might our Eucharistic rites name that more honestly? And so those are two examples from things I've written and thought about. But there's lots more. Yeah.
Those are wonderful, intriguing examples. Thank you for sharing that. What was it? Abide in peace, inhabit the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We may be frozen again.
Are you am I frozen?
I think it may be on my end, but abide in peace, inhabit the Lord.
Yes.
Thank you for those words.
Yeah.
Jeremy says that was after his time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
We have a few more minutes, and I wanted to ask you. Let's see. I'll hold that thought. Sally Ann says, your article also led me to marvel at how interdisciplinary these conversations are, and I appreciate your scholarship, that your scholarship invites us to more interdisciplinary living. Your answer to the last question may answer it, but what are your thoughts about the implications for theological education? What about including a hydrogeology lesson in a course on sacrament, she says. It sounds to me that your teaching position itself answers some of this, which is exciting. And she says this may not be a question, but just something to mention.
A great insight. Yeah. And here at Hartford International University, we're starting to think about, are there ecologically oriented degree programs we might develop, I'm hoping, and then, right, just what you're saying, like what should be included in that. And the Templeton Foundation has had grants
Mhm.
for science education and science and theological education. And you're right. These questions do open up in all directions. So thank you for honoring that and wanting to pursue those kinds of inclusions in the theological curriculum.
Yeah, could definitely change how we prepare for ministry.
Yeah. Yep.
Tom has another comment or question. Tom says, local water ceremonies reinforce our continuing relationship with human ancestors from these lands, and watersheds we now call home. These waters carry their lives and dreams and merge with ours. With their lives, they have blessed the waters. Since these waters also give life to other populations of the watershed, their lives have all blessed these waters.
Wow.
Hence, local waters can be seen as very sacred.
Wow.
Indeed, and amen.
Wow. Yeah, thank you,
Tom.
Yeah.
So perhaps one more question. I have been curious if I want to learn more about my parish creek, and thank you for offering us that that phrase. How might I go about doing that?
Yeah.
Are there
Let me just
government agencies or things that may be useful?
Yeah, I'm gonna share a different slide. If I can find it.
Since reading your article, I've been thinking a lot about my local creek and
Yeah, good.
how to learn more about it.
Yeah, so one resource is the local, every county more or less has a soil and water district. And this website helps you, well, it talks about it. I imagine that to find it, you would just Google your county and soil and water district, wherever you are. And then there's all kinds of local stuff about the water in your area. And so in Franklin County, Columbus, Ohio, where I lived for 10 years, it was Franklin Soil and Water District. And there was a person whose job was Alum Creek, which flowed right next to the seminary. And if you don't know which creek is yours, you can ask them, they will know. And they also know about water quality, and they know about what's needed and who lives here and what, anything you would want to know. These conservation districts are awesome. This is their job. And they love it when people want to learn more, because they can feel like they're doing all their work and nobody cares, kind of, sometimes.
Right.
And then another is the USGS website. There's a map under water. I can send you both of these, and you can actually find your watershed. So if I click here in New England, and then I click here in central Connecticut, where I live, I see here's the Connecticut River that we paddled down. And the fact that I now live in the same watershed as this pilgrimage is really awesome to me. And then I can click here in southern Connecticut and see even more fine-grained. And then you go in as far as it'll go. And then it says additional information for this watershed, at which point you get a whole list of stuff. So if you really want to go deep, you can research all kinds of stuff here. And including things like adopting your watershed and what are the groups that are involved in this place. And this is not very fine-grained. Like lower Connecticut, there's like, I'm actually in the Tumble Brook watershed, which is right behind my house, and the Park River watershed that is at the seminary, the university. And those are much smaller watersheds with their own groups. So you can get even more fine-grained than this particular resource will go. And that's where the county soil and water districts come in to get even more fine-grained. So these are two great resources.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think folks can Google those and find them. Just say the names again for us. Yeah,
the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS. It was water.usgs.gov, I believe, or just watershed USGS will get you there. And then the other is the Soil and Water Conservation Districts by county name.
Wonderful. Thank you. And it occurs to me that this is yet another opportunity to practice our faith in public and to forge partnerships with other organizations, and whether within the church or beyond, other folks who care about the water.
That's right. And building on Tom's comment about people indigenous to this place, I'm too new in this area. I haven't yet met very many indigenous people and groups. But that's an important conversation, contemporary conversation to be having as well, and to honor and recognize their long-term life and love of this place and blessing of these waters, as Tom put it, but also current justice needs, and how can we, in addition to giving land acknowledgements and moving into deeper sacramental connection to our place, recognize and honor the people who we tend to efface and ignore, we settler descendants.
Yeah, those are such important conversations to continue to have. I wonder whether we need to begin having a watershed acknowledgement, just as we often begin worship with a land acknowledgement. Maybe
yes,
develop a practice of saying, this is where we are. These are our local waters.
yes, amen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's been it is a fascinating article. If folks haven't already had a chance to read it, I urge you to do so and check out the rest of the great work in this issue. Thank you, Sally Ann, for editing Call to Worship and sharing Lisa's work with the world. And thanks to all of you who've taken part in this conversation. To those who will check out the recording later online, we are grateful for all of you.
Amen. Thanks, everyone.